Got it. Aloha kako mai ka la pi'i, mai ka la hiki I hae a ka la ho'ohuelo I lehua. Aloha kako a nui. Good afternoon, everyone. I was telling some of the folks earlier that I have a plumbing job happening in my apartment right now that I might need to step away for momentarily. I told them they can see themselves out, but I might have to step away anyway. But mahalo all for coming. Mahalo to the Linguistic Society of Manoa and the Linguistics Department for hosting this event, sponsoring this event. Kind of like the invitation email said, this is a good hour, a good time for anyone who wants sort of a basic rundown of pronunciation in ʻŌlelo Hawaiʻi, and maybe a little bit more deeper understanding of some of the phonology going on. And it can be very, very informal. I probably scheduled in some time for a Q&A to follow, but we can also stop as we go to answer any questions that come up. My other disclaimer is I wish I had a little bit more time to kind of tweak this presentation. Some of you, I apologize if you've already seen it before, such as at the new student orientation. It's very non-specialist. I'm getting a text saying that the water is coming back on in my building. That was the extent of this plumbing job. We had to shut off the water to the whole building. So that has been my distraction for about the past week. So getting settled into this next hour or so with you folks. I was saying that it's very non-specialist, this presentation. I've given it maybe 4 times. This presentation has been given to, of course, the new student orientation, but normally I give it to my Hawaiian language classes at UH. I've also given it to like my halau hula, my hula brothers and hula sisters, as sort of an elementary kind of look into proper pronunciation rules, spelling rules. So with that said, it's not very linguistic-y, but I think that's okay. It's okay, we'll proceed anyway. So let's see, let me share my screen. And again, if you folks have any questions at any time, feel free to raise your hand or interrupt me and we'll address those questions. So, phonology and pronunciation of ʻŌlelo Hawaiʻi. Again, mahalo to the Linguistic Society and the department for having me today. I think today we're gonna cover about 6 topics or so: orthography and spelling, stress, vowel length, vowel combinations, voicing contrast, and POA, MOA. This can be absolutely discussion oriented, ask at any time as mentioned. We'll have a Q&A to follow just in case though. Luckily for us, orthography and spelling in ʻŌlelo Hawaiʻi is pretty consistent. It's very phonetic. It's almost 1-to-1, I'd say. A little bit more on that later on, but some of the history of how we obtained or how we acquired the orthography, which looks like originally was written on something that primers that looked like this. The new missionaries from New England wash up on shore in 1820. Why do I say wash up on shore? Because their itinerary wasn't necessarily set in the 1820s. They weren't, that was, if we know missionary history, they weren't sure they would be they weren't sure they would land, and they weren't sure they would be welcome. So a few of them arrived here in 1820, and within about 5 years, an orthography for ʻŌlelo Hawaiʻi is sort of settled, using the Roman alphabet as we see here, of course. And it was originally taught as a syllabary. If they had these 2 letters, the missionaries would instruct the Hawaiian people, this is a P, this is an A, and together they make Pi'apa. So Pi'apa became the name for the spelling system or orthography that ʻŌlelo Hawaii used as early as the 1820s. Originally, it used all 26 English letters with, of course, the motivation to translate the Bible. I should add to that the diacritic markings were inconsistently used, and who was it? I believe it was Albert or Andrews. I think it was Lauren Andrews who said the missionaries don't or didn't understand the phonemic principle, so they lacked the insight or to include diacritic markings such as a macron and a glottal stop. So it was 26 letters, pretty set at that. But in the aftermath of the creation of an orthography, Hawaiian literacy soars. There's a considerable amount of literature that addresses the booming rates of literacy here in Hawaii by 1835. This mostly follows because the ali'i, or the chiefs of the time, who were ruling the entire kingdom, saw tremendous value in the written word. They saw that it had mana, that it had a way to generate mana or spiritual force or power. And then the orthography, which the missionary orthography, the one created in the 1820s, we usually call it the missionary orthography, was revised essentially by Mrs. Puku'i Wahine, Mary Kamena Puku'i, probably Hawaii's most illustrious Hawaiian scholar, a scholar of history, culture, and language. When I say revised, I mean it was Okina and Kahako were added into the language, and spelling was standardized for the most part. That orthography is not universal. Both orthographies, the missionary orthography and the dictionary orthography, are still in conflict, which is an indication of sort of the vitality of the language, in my opinion. It's probably a setback that we cannot agree on a standard orthography. In the process of Puku'i Wahine in about 1960, when she published the first version of the Hawaiian language dictionary was 1958, the original 26 letters included in the Hawaiian pi'apa was reduced to 13, which we'll look at in the coming slides. But yeah, I think that's all I'll say on that. Some spelling rules that we have in ʻŌlelo Hawaii. We know that there are no consonant clusters. Vowel clusters are allowed. There is still some debate on how many vowels can exist in the same syllable. Diphthongs we know to exist, triphthongs also, but probably not quadriphthongs. Probably not. And also vowel clusters are allowed across syllables. We'll look at some examples later. Here is our inventory of consonants. H, K, L, M, N, P, W as it's written. It's probably more this symbol in the IPA as well as in Okina, or the glottal stop. So the glottal stop actually has a Hawaiian name, Okina. Even this name is sort of modern. It was called by another name before, which is escaping me now, but all of the consonants also have Hawaiian names themselves. He, ke, la, munu, pive, Okina. When we get to the vowels, they're a little bit, maybe a little bit trickier. Most people still teach that ʻŌlelo Hawaii has 5 vowels, probably phonemically, maybe, but on the surface, there are actually 6, and we'll talk about why in the next slide. So the Okina and Kahako account for the 2 diacritic markings. There are only 2. Even that seems to be, enough to create inconsistency in Hawaiian discourse on street signs and maps and most popular discourse. But the okina can be found only between vowels, as it is considered a consonant. I'm realizing now I don't have a slide that shows the consonant, the syllable structure, but hopefully from our examples, we'll be able to glean that. And then the other diacritic marking is the kahako, which is also known as the macron, which elongates vowels.
I have a question.
Yes.
Say the okina is only found between vowels. How about in uku?
Oh. Word initially as well.
Yes. Thank you.
Yeah, I overlooked that. Thanks for that, Bob.
Yeah.
So the vowel chart pictured here, this is where people are surprised to hear that, oh, maybe ʻŌlelo Hawaiʻi has 6 vowels. When E elongates to E, the quality doesn't change, nor does it change with A to A, U to U, O to O, except when we get here, this schwa, when it's short, elongates probably to this sort of low back vowel. And we'll see some examples. This is kind of critical. When I was in undergrad taking beginning Hawaiian language, this wasn't part of the curriculum, and I don't think it is still to this day, meaning that most people will still teach 5 vowels. I think that plays a part in affecting pronunciation among L2 speakers. Let's talk about stress for the next few slides. Penultimate stress, unless diacritically marked otherwise. A pretty straightforward rule. I was never taught this rule until I sort of considered it after I had been in the linguistics MA program for a few years. There is primary and secondary stress in multisyllabic words, but otherwise, this rule of penultimate stress is not articulated the way it is in this presentation. I think it would help if it was in a sort of elementary curriculum. So we can predict that stress in ʻŌlelo Hawaiʻi is going to fall on the second to last syllable. We have examples of multisyllabic words, such as kapu, penultimate stress, same as wahine. In a trisyllabic word, same as hi'olani, 4 syllables, ho'oniua, 5 syllables, the stress is not moving. Even if another vowel in the non-penultimate syllable is long, such as where our university is situated, I hear a lot of sort of hypercorrectness or maybe over enunciation in the pronunciation of this word, because there is a kahako, a long vowel over this first vowel. It's almost as if the kahako moves the stress. But what we should ask ourselves, is this 2 syllables or 3 syllables? Al Sheets talks extensively about how vowel sonority is sort of handling or assigning stress or assigning syllabification, determining syllabification. We see that there is one long vowel in this, at least on the surface. However, stress does not move. So instead of this kahako moving stress to the first vowel, it's not manoa. The kahako doesn't make it anti-penultimate stress. It's probably still 3 syllables. This has secondary stress, and this penultimate syllable still has primary stress. So we would pronounce it manoa. Manoa. This is going to matter when other words, when vowel length is contrastive, especially, and we'll see this example in this slide. But as I was saying earlier, there's the only vowel to change quality based on its length is the a. And we see that in pronunciations such as manoa versus this here, this is pronounced like ah, versus manu, which is the word for bird, any flying object, which is more of a schwa. Manoa versus manu. What else can we say about this? Since vowel length contrasts meaning, we want to be careful about, we want to pay attention to these, to the vowel length every time we pronounce them. Kane is the name of a very important deity in the polytheistic pantheon of Hawaiian religion and probably Eastern Polynesian religion. It's also the word for male. When we don't have a long ah, so this vowel will be pronounced as kane, we have the word for the Latin term is tinea versicolor. There are local names for this skin disease, which is just a fungus that grows under the skin. You don't want to be calling this deity using the word for a skin fungus. Kane versus kane. Like I said, ah is the only vowel that changes quality depending on its length. Versus ah, the others generally stay the same, and the only difference, the only contrast is length. Usually the difference between long and short vowels in ʻŌlelo Hawaiʻi is very slight. I think I bring up this point because I hear over enunciation, too much attention on long vowels. And if we understand long vowels as originating from possibly vowel one, glottal stop, vowel one, and they've been reduced because they lost the glottal and they're just slightly longer, I think that is an important distinction. That isn't really part of the general curriculum or Hawaiian language education. So all that to say, we want to avoid overemphasizing kahako. Vowel combinations. ʻŌlelo Hawaiʻi has plenty of them. They're almost always phonetic, lucky for us. ʻŌlelo Hawaiʻi uses diphthongs and triphthongs, as I mentioned earlier. Some examples of double vowel in a single syllable are vau, oi, and ua. Examples of triple vowels in a single syllable, awi, awa. This is probably up for debate. Some people might parse that into two syllables. Again, there is no really, there's no real research putting rhyme and reason to this kind of thing. I would love if there was more research happening in that. ʻŌlelo Hawaiʻi uses vowel combinations that also span syllables. This is the name of Kamehameha III, who had the longest rule in the Hawaiian kingdom. We see his name is made up of 5 morphemes. The first one is a diphthong. The second one, I gotta move my, let's see, is a single vowel and a single syllable. The next one, these 2 morphemes combine to create 3 vowels across 2 syllables. And the last one, of course, the last morpheme is 2 syllables in a VCV structure. Kawi Kiauli. We'll probably come back to this. This is a name that seems to scare a lot of people when having to pronounce it, when faced with the prospect of pronouncing this name correctly. And he is a very important king in Hawaiian history. So maybe I understand where that trepidation comes from. I usually tell my students to beware of vowel combinations that mutually contrast. I versus ai. There are some teachers in the Hawaiian language department that really drill students in distinguishing between these combinations because they change meaning, of course. I versus ai or oi versus oi. In this very relevant example, poi would describe the shape of this moon as round, poi. But if I say poi, some of you folks might conjure this image of local food, Hawaiian food, which is pounded kalo, but we call this poi. In local vernacular, it's probably more so pronounced, more commonly pronounced poi. So one thing we are working, that's a pretty significant area of confusion in the larger revitalization context of ʻŌlelo Hawaiʻi. Voicing contrasts. I don't need to say anything. I don't need to explain that any further. We can just go into some of the examples. Of course, voicing contrast, especially of word initial stops, is less pronounced than in English. And there is another important chief in Kamehameha's court whose name was Poki. But if K and T are allophonic, sometimes his name was written as Poti. And if P and B are allophonic, then his name has four possible spellings. Doing research on this chief in primary sources, such as the Hawaiian language newspapers, is quadruply difficult. You have to look for his name, one of four spellings. And they're all generally consistently attested. So with that, we can say that P and B are allophonic, as are K and T and L and R, which leads us to talking about aspiration. We can say that ʻŌlelo Hawaiʻi, I guess I'm kind of zooming through this. ʻŌlelo Hawaiʻi does not aspirate PT or K, these stops, as English does, which is pretty difficult in getting students to undo that aspiration in L2 contexts. So I show them this kind of example. I have them say the word paper in standard English, and then this Hawaiian language word papa, which means class, a classroom, or also means layer. This word initial stop has no aspiration. So it's kind of a neat, brief introduction to phonetics and linguistics and what aspiration is, particularly relevant in 2020, when there was this study that came out proposing that using aspirated consonants during speech may increase airborne diseases such as COVID-19. So the incentive is to correctly speak ʻŌlelo Hawaiʻi in order to reduce the risk of viral transmission. The last thing, I know I'm realizing I'm zooming through this, but place of articulation, manner of articulation, I really sort of find it helpful in a classroom to kind of break these down and ask students, where is your, how are your lips in relation to your tongue, or is your tongue touching your teeth? Is your tongue touching the roof of your mouth, etc.? I usually present these 4 sounds, LTVW, and say that these same sounds, these same graphemes represented identically in the orthography are not exactly the same in pronunciation. And the difference is, ʻŌlelo, I would say the tongue taps the roof of the mouth, but it's lax. Standard English, I believe the liquid is not as lax. It's almost a flap, especially if it's allophonic. If we understand the liquid to be allophonic with the rhotic, or the flap, not rhotic. T is another kind of difficult sound. In English, T is very different than a Hawaiian T. I think because we normally pronounce its allophone, K. So we're maybe not used to pronouncing a T. It's more of a somewhere in between a T and a D. I tell my students, maybe move your tongue, advance your tongue a little bit, such that it touches the teeth. Not tita, but more tita.
So I have another question, if I may. When you talk about the Hawaiian T, are you talking about ni'iha or?
the originally in the pre-orthographic times, then if we
Okay.
understand the K and T uh, as allophonic. But to reconstruct it, that's all sort of, we don't have, there are very few recordings of native speakers producing Ts outside of Kauai Niha.
The old maps, of course, have Morotai for Molokai and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
Hawaii for Kauai.
Tawai, right. So yeah, it's a good question. I would probably say it corresponds, if this is representing spoken speech, then it's corresponding to Niihau and Kauai.
Mhm.
But if this is representing historical speech, then it's representing the dialect chain.
Okay.
And then this last one, vau or vahine, it is always pretty difficult to teach the pronunciation of this sound. It's somewhere between a hard V and not a hard V, but neither a soft W. I think there is, if you look at Te Reo Teiti, the Tahitian language, that's alternating based on phonology. The sound prior to this is going to determine which allophone is pronounced. That might have been a historical pattern that was sort of lost or obscured in ʻŌlelo Hawaii. There is a very rule-based allophonic alternation in closely related languages. I'm not sure what happened in ʻŌlelo Hawaii. Nowadays, we usually just say they are interchangeable. It's a great research question. But somewhere I usually tell these to my students, it's somewhere between it's not a hard V, it's not a soft W. Whoa, whoa, somewhere in between. Other tips, I guess, for those who just kind of want to maybe a little bit more fluid pronunciation. For round vowels, it really does help to round your lips. It sounds obvious, but I don't think we really do that in English. So you look at native speakers of Hawaiian still around today, they certainly round their lips when they pronounce round vowels. And it absolutely acoustically affects their pronunciation in ways that I would say are different than the pronunciation of L2 speakers. Passive listening helps. This is kind of a plug for our department, kaniaina.org. Our department, Andrea and a few others were involved in this wonderful, the creation of this wonderful resource, which is it provides audio recordings and time-aligned transcriptions of native speakers and interviews. Helps with pronunciation. You can start by reading street signs. We're lucky to still have Mrs. Pukui said, ʻŌlelo Hawaii is still on everyone's tongue because it exists on our signs. And that's a sort of a benefit in the larger linguistic situation. I usually end with this, these two phrases that are pretty similar in pronunciation that I ask my students to pay close attention to the differences in this pronunciation. Ke la kolohe versus ke la kolohe. If there's not a contrasting, if I can't hear a contrast, then there's probably some improvement that can happen. Let me see, a question came up in the chat. Victoria is asking, is the word for grandparent ever pronounced with a K? That's a really good question. Why does this item get frozen with T when T is so rare in non-Niihau and non-Kauai speech? Really good question. I have a friend from Manoa, who she calls her grandmother Kuku and not Tutu. And I asked her one day why, and she she said that that was how it always how she was always referred as Kuku. I'm not sure why. Um, I'm not sure why tea got frozen. I think that's a fascinating research question. Um, I'm trying to think of other words that are frozen with tea. Yeah, can't really think of any others, but really good question, Victoria. Tita is a little bit different because it comes from the word sista.
Yeah.
It's a loan word. So probably the borrowing process was a little bit different. But the interesting thing about these words, if you're gonna look for them in the dictionary, you have to look for their allophones. Kika. Kuahine and tuahine. I'm not sure why tuahine seems to be the more popular pronunciation. These are all good examples.
I have another question, if I may. ʻŌlelo Hawaii, as used in daily speech, differs, I understand, from the ʻŌlelo Hawaii of the chants. Can you tell us something about those differences?
I guess the first difference, the most noticeable difference, would be the content and the register of speaking. If we're thinking about the function of oli or chant, which predates Western music and lyrics sung to Western music, you're writing about. Not to say they can't be repurposed or they cannot be composed for contemporary reasons and functions, but most of those oli are talking about, ecological process. Not most, but many of them are talking about cosmogony or origins or geological processes. So their language is certainly antiquated and obscure and arcane. So, and that's sort of on purpose, purposefully esoteric. And vernacular is sort of the opposite of that.
Do you get more of the T's in the chant than K's?
Depends. It depends. It's a good question. I think it's a stylistic choice. Sorry. Give me 1 minute, Bob.
Oh, okay.
I have the plumbers here.
Yeah.
They have left the building. Yeah, Bob, I think that's a stylistic choice. T sometimes morphs into S as a sort of, very fricative, maybe to gain more attention from the audience. A K becomes T and then T goes beyond to become an S. I've heard that in chanting it's more a embellishment, I would say.
Okay, thanks.
Could you contrast the two words, one for meal and the other one for land, and what happens to that initial diphthong? And do people actually maintain a difference between them?
L2 speakers probably generally it's very slight if contrastive at all. Aina and aina, but yeah, it's if you look at mele and phrasing when singing Hawaiian lyrics, there's oka'aina. Oka'aina is of the land, as if the is occupying its own syllable, its own foot in the pronunciation in the phrasing of the lyrical performance. That says something about the syllabification of that word. versus aina, like you said, Ken, was that you? Aina means meal. Aina is meal. Aina is land. I think that first long ah in aina is 3 syllables, and aina for meal is 2.
So you
So the
see that,
distinction should be maintained.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah.
so you're saying that the one with the 3 syllables, the I in the 3 syllables, that's a long ah.
In the
The
word for
kahako.
land. Mm-hmm.
It's a kahako, the one with for land, right?
The one
Yeah.
for land has a kahako over their first ah.
So do you have diphthongs with kahako, with the kahako as or e?
Good question. Anybody think of diphthongs with where one of the vowels is elongated? Keolai? I can't think of any. It's a really good question. But that is goes back to Al Sheets, and I forget who he's citing another. He's citing the falling vowel sonority affecting syllabification of adjacent vowels. Really good question. I
Yeah,
can't think of any.
can I ask, like, au versus ua. So if you have au, which is falling sonority, because a is really loud and u is less loud, that's one syllable, right? But is ua 2 or 1?
I would say, good question, Victoria. What? I want to say 1. In L2 speech, it's almost pronounced like this with a word initial glottal. You look at closely related languages that have that same morpheme, and it means the same, it has the same significance. They pronounce it more like wa, which leads me to think that it's probably monosyllabic.
Question, if that's the case, since W is alternatively pronounced as something very close to V, could this word be pronounced va? I doubt it.
I doubt that too. Yeah. But if we know that a W can, IPAW is a very quick oo, then maybe that IPA is probably more accurate for the pronunciation of ua, the completive verb aspect.
Okay.
Quick note on this perfective particle. Also in Maori, it is kua with a K at the front.
That's true. Yeah. In Aotearoa Māori and in Rarotonga Cook Island Māori, it's kua. Yeah.
Susan Inoue has a really good comment here. Could you test this using the stress rule so that well, I suppose in isolation you couldn't tell, because if it's wa, then it's stressed on. There's only 1 syllable to stress, but if it's ua, then you'll hear a difference in the position of the stress on u versus a. Is that what you were thinking, Susan?
Yeah. That's a wonderful question. The penultimate stress rule seems to would want to, if it's too, where's the stress? Well, yeah, I think it, thinking about the pronunciation of ua in the penultimate stress rule would probably, I would probably conclude it's monosyllabic still. Kapua'ala, when it comes to the kahako and emphasis or overemphasis, when pronouncing the vowels with kahako, should it be effortless when saying it? Should be a clear difference between saying o,
This brings up the question whether ua is acclitic.
I was gonna say, I've never heard anyone hypothesize that until today. Maybe it's acclitic. Let me see. I'm scrolling up to some questions that are in the chat. Does T get substitute for other letters besides K, or is it just K? T, well, you look in the dictionary, nahesa is the word for serpent. We took that from the Hebrew, we borrowed it from the Hebrew pronunciation. But in the revised orthography, S went to K. So K represents a whole bunch of sounds in natural classes that when the orthography was revised, it's represented with K. So, there's into the allophone class, we can add S, we can add Z, we can add G. That's when it gets pretty confusing. The orthography revision in the 1960s sort of hacked away all those other sounds, and it kind of limited the inventory. Timothy has a question. Are there other regularities in how borrowed sounds are adapted to phonology? I think O.E.V. Parker Jones writes about this. He would be a perfect person to ask for this. It's a good question, Caroline. Bob, you have any insight on other regularities in how borrowed sounds are adapted?
Well, S is invariably K, so far as I know. I don't know of any cases where S is not a K. And maybe you can think of one. Voice stops normally, my name, Robert Lopaka, is, Lopaka is obviously got a P rather than a B because, Hawaiian doesn't really have voice stops, at least contrastively. And then of course, T, D, as you say, S, all come out as K. G as well. What else? No. K has to serve a lot of purposes. It really corresponds to a lot of different sounds in English, because English is sort of consonant rich, and Hawaiian has got just the 8, basically.
Mm-hmm.
So probably the affricates j and ch also come out as K.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
As well. Yeah.
On words like church, for example, or judge.
There's an interesting thing happening though. What's a good example? A vowel followed by sort of a rhoticized in English, like let me think of an example. Something like this word. When that was borrowed, I should think of a proper name that has AR in the beginning. When that was borrowed into ʻŌlelo Hawaiʻi and transliterated, that is usually always this long So how did Hawaiian phonology deal with the rhotic after it? It created a long vowel. No research has been done to kind of, as far as I know, to track that historically.
Keep in mind that the English that Hawaiians were exposed to was Bostonian English at first, in which you probably wouldn't have heard that R.
And it would be long.
And it would be long. Exactly.
Right. Right. Bostonian from 1820s, Connecticut even.
Well, the missionaries are mostly from Boston, I think. So, and you know, if there was anything like modern Bostonian English, you're not going to hear that R and the R is going to be long.
Interesting. Yeah, that's an important thing to remember.
I was gonna say also in Samoan, different language, but when you have the AR, they do the long A as well. So bar just gets translated as ba. So it's a similar feature.
Mhm. Kent, you had a question? Kent?
See, I forgot the question. I'm sorry. I was going to say, I mean, the TK thing, you know, I remember years ago, there was someone who wrote the possibility of actually another sound, that there was, in fact, it was neither a T or a K, it was something else that then fluctuates between T's and K's, I think. And the other point I wanted to make is that this is, you know, it is dialectal. I think it's dialectal. Probably, as you said, Kauai and Niihau use a lot of was a T dialect, right? Because my grandparents were from Japan, lived way up in the valley in a Hawaiian village, and she used a lot of T in the words. I mean, you know, she had no kina, she had no nothing like that, but words like mai kai became mai tai. And she didn't know what a mai tai was, so it wasn't from the drink or anything like that, but you know, she would use stuff like that. So the T existed as, you know, or a form or some kind of form of the T, I think, existed in certain dialects. And I think what happens when they started to introduce writing to it, right, is which dialect they picked from. So it's a, you know, if they were in where the kingdom was, you know, then, I mean, where the monarchy was, you know, basically, it might have taken from that dialect. And that's why you maintain a lot of cases. Whereas the chants and stuff, I think, Anna, don't quote me on this, but, you know, there are a lot of the hula stuff and chants and things, right? A lot of it originated on Kauai. And I'm thinking there's a lot of carryover from T's from that tradition as well. So, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I'm not 100% sure, but I know that the birth of hula is supposedly on Kauai. So,
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that, Kent. The hula genealogy lineage that I'm trained in comes from Kauai, Piheleo, and Okano from Hanalei.
Mhm.
Yeah. So that could have certainly influence in how the performance of these hula are pronounced.
My understanding has always been that the missionaries are uncertain about whether to write either T or K. And part of the reason is because there was a lot of fluctuation at the time. And this has to do with the T to K pronunciation spreading up from the Big Island when Kamehameha I conquered the islands and united them. And the change was spreading as a result of that conquest, which happened just shortly before the Cook voyages arrived here. And then the missionaries were just, what, 40 years later or so, 50 years later.
you see in writing, you see Kamehameha instead of Kamehameha too. So,
With a T at first, yeah.
yeah, with a T, Kamehameha, yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So Captain Cook, 1778, unification 1810, Kamehameha dies 1819, missionaries come 1820.
All close
there's-
together.
What is that?
All close together.
You're right. Right. As I understand, the missionary decision to use K over T and L over R was sort of idiosyncratic, and they just said it was a toss-up.
Mhm.
And it privileged, if this dialect chain was very much intact at the time, it privileged one side of it.
Right.
But when earlier, Ken, you were saying there's a sound between T and K, it made me think of when we write this word T-A with a long A. Sa. It's more pronounced like kya. almost with like a palatalized stop. This word, this sound, this phoneme isn't going to make it into the inventory because it's more used as an expression of disapproval. It sounds literally like, you're kind of like coughing up, coughing up spit to express disapproval. I don't know if this ever extended into sort of words spoken colloquially, this sound, cha, but it exists in the native speaker inventory. It's probably not written down though. So that's
Can
why
you-
we had to write it
Can you
down.
give examples? Can you give examples of the usage of that?
Yeah, one of my favorite examples is when kupuna are sort of chastising some hula that's too modern, for example. They'll say, "Chia." It's very animated, "Chia hele oi pela." How would you translate that? It's just, oh my goodness, hang it up.
I actually remember hearing it growing up as well too, but
Yeah.
not as strong as that. Not in the Hawaiian context, even in a local context. I used to hear a lot of cha, cha, because it's like a disappointment or a disgust.
really interesting.
Yeah.
It's really interesting because both ch and a are not native to, they're not phonemes. It's kind of like in English where we've got a click that it isn't a word, but it serves in some paralinguistic way.
That vowel doesn't seem to, Tahitian has it. That's the only Eastern Polynesian language I know has it, that ah. Hawaiian only has it, and it's reserved for those very, Ken, you probably heard it, if it's not as strong, like, yeah, it's, a lot of people say, yeah, like that. It's sort of reduced form in pidgin.
Mhm.
Same meaning though, yeah.
But
That-
it could be a palatal stop. It could have come from a palatal stop, yeah, which
Mhm.
would go back to what Kent is saying about sort of a middle ground or a,
Or
an
another
allophony.
sound.
Yeah, an allophony that goes back and forth and between.
Yeah.
Possibility of another consonant even
Mhm.
that gets lost.
Right. I think it was certainly lost in the missionary orthography, and even further when this expression of disapproval is, it doesn't really, you don't hear it much anymore in L2 contexts.
I have another question that's been bothering me more recently, and that
Mm.
has to do with the W. So the when I was studying Hawaiian, this is like way back, so back in the 70s. My teacher was from Niihau, and there were some words that she would use that actually, like the Hawaiianized word for fever, so piva, right? And I asked her to repeat it several times because at the time I was always interested in phonetics. So I was watching her lips and stuff, and what she's producing is in fact a bilabial fricatives, right? And I think that might account for the fact that it goes either V or W today. But here's the thing that I learned, and this has been disappearing when people explain the difference, is that generally the V sound comes after a front vowel. The W sound comes after a back vowel, and with the ah, it can go either way. So Hawaii, that kind of thing. But that has disappeared. So I'm just wondering if if that's no longer viable.
I think it absolutely should be viable, and it's sort of this human arrogance that we took it out in the 21st century. I say that because I work with nonprofit organization, and we are basically taking primary sources, transcribing them in dictionary orthography, and then translating them, mostly newspaper articles from 1860 all the way to 1920. Anytime the W, especially when it was a glide, we took it out. When it was written as OWU, for example, or UWO, we took it out as a glide. When it was word initial versus like such as O versus O, VO and O are allomorphic, and we took it out. I think we did a great disservice to this sort of text that we're creating, this manuscript that we've created by stripping the W. We standardized it, I believe. We took all of them out and made them into L. And that's data, that's rich data that unless we go back and put in, revise all 400 pages, we've taken it out. I would love to find, like I was saying earlier in Tahitian, there's a rule that predicts the W or not. I'm pretty sure ʻŌlelo Hawaii, at least historically, had a similar one, even if the rule was sort of threadbare at that point. We need to pay attention to that. What context more, even if it's just written, even if this is a written resource, I think we're taking it out and standardizing it as all of them as O is not a good thing. It's we're removing a lot of rich data. Let me see. Can you look at I think Victoria, you're asking for when they hear versus that sneaky rascal. So let me type it one more time in the chat. When they hear ke lako lohe versus ke la kolohe. The first will be ke la kolohe, and the second is ke la kolohe. Slight differences. There's no the lohe in this vowel combination does not exist in the second phrase, but I hope that answered your question, Victoria.
That's what I wanted to hear, especially the 410 students that are here, to hear that difference between a monophthong and a diphthong, with O and O. Well, I'm totally exaggerating, but and it's subtle. It's subtle when you said them naturally.
Right. It is subtle. Yeah.
Can I put my hand up? Just
Sure.
because I'm talking, sorry. I'm wondering, I've got a couple of friends who really would like to learn some Hawaiian, and they're doing it on Duolingo. And I'm wondering whether you have any experience with that, or whether you approve of voices or know who they are. Or
I do sort of know who the recorded voices are. When I played around in Duolingo, specifically the Hawaiian language Duolingo, it didn't seem instructive, it just seemed corrective. And I'm not sure if you're starting from square one or even square zero, I think that's not really gonna give much direction. So yeah, Duolingo seems to, at least for the Hawaiian language program, you have to have kind of a little bit, maybe use a textbook as you're working your way through the levels. Otherwise, it's not going to teach you. It's just going to tell you when you're wrong. So there are a lot of resources though that are even open source and free. I would check out Kamehameha Schools on YouTube. I think it's called Ho'okulaiwi. And if you're interested in more, I'm happy to send out those resources to you, Victoria. There's a considerable amount of resources that if people want to learn, they can turn to. Anu, did you have a question?
I did. Sometimes when I'm hearing people speak ʻŌlelo, there are times when what's orthographically written as the like I, so like a long E, sounds more like an A when it doesn't have the kahako on it. And that I was thinking quite recently, I was listening to a couple of people at the Hawaiian School of Knowledge talking about the lo'i, and when they were saying like lo'i o kanewai, the E at the end of it sounded more like an A. And I'm wondering if that's because of like assimilation or whether that's because there's, I don't know, whether they're first language, second language speakers, whether there's a difference.
Yeah. So that was that slide that I was talking about, vowel combinations that are mutually contrastive. I versus IE, this is that exact vowel combination that I think we have to be careful of, that are sort of fused together in L2 speech, kanewai. I would probably say that's English transfer.
I see. Interesting.
Yeah. Kanewai versus kanewai. Yeah, even this place name has both of those vowel combinations in its name, and they, in most local pronunciation, they don't really contrast. Why not? The Okina drops and also the two vowel combinations are not contrastive, and they should be. One of my mentors, Pulkia Nogelmeyer, says it's not that you're pronouncing it, wrong. It's just that the original name and the correct pronunciation does index a meaning, which is lost when the pronunciation is changed. Same with Waiʻalae as well. Yeah. Emma, did you have a question, Emma?
Yeah, I had a kind of similar question actually, because I noticed earlier, and I've heard this before, like the difference between Hawaii versus Hawaii. And I was wondering if the vowel was because of the VW or if it was just like a how Hawaiian the pronunciation is.
Yeah, so if we're talking about the pronunciation in the wider context of local pronunciation versus standard English pronunciation, which is also, it's probably going to be Hawaii, versus Hawaii, maybe local pronunciation is Hawaii, versus really sort of hyper correct pronunciation Hawaii. Again, it's sort of which pronunciation are we staying loyal to? Or even to complicate this even further, we can't really trace confidently the etymology of Hawaii the way we can trace Waiʻanae or Waiʻalae. So at least we have the meaning of Waiʻanae and Waiʻalae to justify proper pronunciation, whereas Hawaii is so old, we've probably surmising sort of the etymology or the meaning of the name is folk etymology at this point. So I think that gives sort of more freedom or more kind of inconsistency in pronunciation of Hawaii, 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 all of those kind of alternatives. I have heard kupuna say Hawaii. I've heard them say Hawaii. I've heard them say Hawaii, and I've heard it's pronounced Hawaii. So those four, one of those four would probably be the safest, but probably not Hawaii.
It's kind of, I think, taking it back to the 70s during the, the Renaissance kind of thing. I think it coming from that period there, I think it was almost like a a choice to make it as distinct from Hawaii as possible. So like so picking the V instead of the W pronunciation to make it more separable.
Right.
Yeah, I think that was a kind of a decision that the people doing this decided at that time, I think. But I had a question though. I mean, going back to what Anu said earlier, I think what she was talking about is the IA distinction. And because I remember being taught in that there is in fact when you pronounce it, my teacher used to say that they do. It's a very in fast speech, and particularly the I can become A. In and I can't remember the words right now, but off the top of my head, but then there is this process, and it happens in a number of words where something becomes I become A in pronunciation.
Are you talking about like this, Kent? But be really quick before I get to this minimal pair. Really important point you brought up 2 minutes ago about the tendency to choose the more dissimilar form in sort of revitalization context, especially the Renaissance, to express a more Hawaiian identity. That's a really important dimension of history that probably certainly impacted pronunciation of Hawaiian among that kind of generation of heritage speakers. So that's a fascinating research question. But anyway, this minimal pair, I think maybe you're talking about mai versus may, this AI. Sometimes there's vowel raising. Mai, this is a monosyllabic word. So we have a diphthong, a-e, to accommodate for the, sort of to compromise the two vowel spaces. Sometimes vowel raising will happen. So it's written as mai, sometimes it comes out as may.
Yeah, I think that's kind of what happens. Yeah. So it's yeah, I think I don't know, Anu, is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, I was wondering because sometimes I'll see it orthographically written as an I, but the pronunciation sounds more like A than E. And I don't know if that's just because of the proximity it has to another vowel and it's being diphthongized or not.
Good question. If you can notice an example in natural speech, on message me if you remember. Would love
I
to
definitely will.
This happens, and I know that Bob can give us more languages, but this happens regularly in Tagalog, where mayroon, which means there is very often pronounced meron. Same thing in careful versus natural speech. That vowel raising to sort of shrink the diphthong down.
Is there a word like kai kamahine?
Yeah, kai kamahine.
And yeah, I think that was one of the words that they said when they pronounce it becomes kika mahine or something like that. So kaika becomes kika.
That's a pretty widely attested example. Underlying form is probably kai kamahine. Surface form is more kai kamahine.
We probably have time for one more question.
This is a great discussion with all you folks. I'm wondering if there are any other questions in the chat that we can get around to. Ala was asking about dialects, and I think the dialects were mostly intact. They had developed by the time missionaries came. So I wouldn't say the dialect differentiation was a result of contact with missionaries. I hope that answered your question, Ala. But wow, this was great. I learned plenty from you folks. Thank you so much. I think we left.
Thank you so much.
There's a lot
yeah, I think There were about 20 research questions that you mentioned. Yeah, please, everyone, round of applause for Ha'a. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
And if it's okay, I might get everyone who would like to have their camera on to please put their camera on, and we'll get a screenshot for the LSM social media. All right, everybody smile. Lovely. Wonderful. Okay, another round of applause. That was really great. Thank you everyone for participating, and thank you so much, Ha'a, for sharing your time and your knowledge with us.
That was awesome. That was wonderful. Mahalo to you all.
Mahalo nui.